Hi all, good morning. So I'm Oren from the Department of Cognitive and Brain Sciences. And let's just start. So in the Department of, or in Brain Sciences, we use tools for machine learning and data sciences in two very different domains. One is to analyze the data that we acquire, and the other is to model the brain. So most of the things that I'll show you today briefly is about the data analysis. Typically, data that we acquire in brain sensors are very high dimensional, not necessarily big data. In many cases, we have small data because it's hard to obtain brain activity from humans for long periods or from many subjects. But it's typically high dimensional, like many voxels in fMRI, many electrodes, and many time points in EEG data, and so on and so forth. And then we typically apply pre-processing because the data include artifacts. We need to filter it and do a lot of artifact removal before we even start to consider the data, and then we extract features and apply different machine learning algorithms. Some of them could be neural networks. And then we also use neural networks for modeling the brain. So it could be detailed models, but often we use simplified models of neural networks to model cognitive phenomena in the brain, not necessarily to develop an industrial application. So that's kind of the big picture of data sciences. A little bit about things in my lab. So my lab combines theoretical and experimental work. So we collect our data and we also do the machine learning and data science part. So for example, we have a project where we try to develop a system for monitoring epileptic patients and predict seizures. So the idea is to put some kind of a portable hardware on patients, what we call dry EEG, electrodes that do not require the conducting gel. We need to extract some features. This is where we come as brain scientists, with using some nonlinear dynamics, all kinds of models of network analysis, complexity, what we call critical brain dynamics and other aspects. We put these features into machine learning algorithms and try, in this case, to produce a seizure alert. So we train machine learning algorithms with some labeled data. And the learning algorithm is trained to predict if there's going to be a seizure in the next hour. We also try to use, of course, the raw EEG data, but often you don't have enough data, so that's why we need to use some kind of nonlinear measures that are inspired by computational models to extract information before we even put them into the learning algorithms. And another project in my lab, we work with the Israeli Air Force, and we try to develop kind of a pilot helmet with EEG electrodes embedded inside. So we travel, for example, with fighter pilots to the Netherlands or Germany to centrifuge training. We put EEG caps on the head, and we measure the brain activity during 9G acceleration, and some of them lose consciousness, and we try to develop measures that can warn a few seconds just before a G-lock event, a G-induced loss of consciousness. And we also have experiments on spatial disorientation, hypoxia, sleep deprivation. We measure pilots during some drills of prolonged sleep deprivation, and also cognitive workload. And then we extract many informative measures, and we use them to kind of assess the cognitive state of the pilot and generate warnings when necessary. Here's another project that we did in collaboration with Kobi Gal from Information and Systems Engineering. And we essentially let about 50 subjects do intelligence tests that involve this matrix of shapes, and you need to decide what is the missing shape. And they go at an increasing level of difficulty, which is verified by the number of errors in the population. So we know that question number 1 is a very low error rate, whereas question number 36 has a very high error rate. And we can see that from the EEG we can predict the level of difficulty of the questions. That just knowing the EEG of the question that you're working on, your EEG during working, we can kind of predict the difficulty level. So we use machine learning in many different contexts, but also for modeling. So this is, in my lab, we use a lot of information theory, entropy, to generate models, for example, with recurrent connections. And these models can essentially captures this idea of hallucination. They can show persistent activity or some activity even without external input. And we find that actually the models that try to optimize information representation tend to operate near the border of hallucinations on a critical point. So criticality is a very interesting concept and it has computational advantages. We also investigate criticality in the context of deep networks, because it can be used to kind of identify long-range temporal or spatial correlations in the data. The lab of Galia Avidan, they do typically work with fMRI in the context of face perception, visual perception in general, and they used a lot of complex network analysis, brain connectivity. They showed interesting findings related to face perception and prosopagnosia, this disease where people do not recognize faces. And for example, in a recent study, they used the word2vec, a famous unsupervised algorithm, and they applied it to connectivity data. So kind of taking a network, a graph, running just kind of a simulated path on the network, and using word2vec to identify different relationships between the nodes, and even they could predict what would happen if, after a certain lesion to a node, to a certain brain system, and verify it experimentally that it actually works. They have interesting predictions. It was a high-profile paper. The lab of Lior Shmuelov works on motor control, so it's a lot of learning, and they also use concepts from the theory of learning to study skill acquisition. For example, in a joint project, Lior and I, essentially a postdoc of ours, studied the interaction between human learning and machine learning in brain-computer interface, because when we let subjects control a brain-computer interface, for you can see in this video, we adapt a machine learning algorithm to recognize patterns of activity in the brain and to recognize if your intent is to turn left or right. But then as subjects obtain the skill, the brain activity changes. So they adapt to the computer, but the computer adapts to them. And this co-adaptive learning process is actually very interesting. Dr. Neil Fresco is a new recruit in our lab. So he has background in computer sciences, but he's also a philosopher, and he studies information and claims that in order to understand biological and cognitive processes, we should go beyond Shannon and Fisher information and use what he calls, with some colleagues, functional information. Yair Newman in our department studies computational personality, so based on analysis of texts that were written by persons to generate quantitative models of personality. He also studies temporal semantic data and in some general models of cognitive systems. For example, he has a paper, is it here, about, the first one, the adaptive behavior of a soccer team, an entropy-based analysis. So these kind of studies, I'm just telling you, so if people are interested to collaborate with some people in my department. We also have Talia Sadeh, she's a memory person. So she gathers a lot of data and analyzes typically not too advanced machine learning techniques, but they use, for example, what's called multivoxel pattern analysis to study memory representations and mnemonic performance. They study eye tracking data. So they do behavioral experiments with eye tracking data, and then they try to see if they can predict memory performance from eye tracking data, and also use reactions time. So this was kind of maybe low dimensional, but the fMRI is pretty high dimensional. That's it. I think maybe I'll tell just a few words about courses. We don't have, a list of courses like other departments, but in my courses on computation and cognition, I do teach for quite a few years methods in deep learning, of course. So we go from perceptrons from linear and binary things to multi-layers and deep learning techniques, and also other machine learning techniques and reinforcement learning, principal components analysis, independent component analysis, these kind of things. So we do study them both in the context of data analysis and in the context of modeling brain activity. Thank you very much.